one king sitting alone beneath. The palace did not tremble when the decree was signed. It went silent. One pen stroke, one closed folder.
The palace did not tremble when the decree was signed. It went quiet instead, the way old stone buildings go quiet before a storm, as if the walls themselves understood that something irreversible had just happened inside them. In the kingdom of Valemore, King Edric sat alone in the long study with a single folder open before him, the ink barely dry, and for the first time in 30 years of rule, he did not know whether he had done the right thing. The folder contained the instrument of succession amendment, a private legal order that, once sealed, would quietly remove his two youngest grandchildren, Rowan and Aloan, from the formal line of inheritance to the Valemore throne. He had read it 3 times. Each time, the words seemed less like law and more like a verdict on his own family. Edric had not made the decision lightly. For months, the Privy Council had pressed him with what they called the Continuity Risk Assessment, a confidential review measuring how unresolved questions about the succession might one day be exploited, contested, or dragged into public scandal. The report was blunt. It named Rowan and Aloan, the children of his younger son Prince Cassian and Caesian's wife Duchess Wren, as the most vulnerable point in the entire royal structure. The children lived abroad, far from court, raised largely outside the traditions and obligations of the crown. To leave their status ambiguous, the council warned, was to leave a door open that future rivals, tabloids, or even distant cousins could one day try to force. Edric had asked, more than once, whether there was another way, some middle path that preserved both stability and affection. The council's answer never changed. Ambiguity, they told him, was not neutral. It was a vacuum, and vacuums in royal law had a long history of being filled by exactly the people a crown could least afford to empower. The king had spent 3 sleepless nights turning that argument over, searching for the flaw in it, and finding none he could defend to his own conscience. Edric closed the folder with the same care a man might use closing a coffin lid. He did not celebrate. He rang a small silver bell on his desk, and when his private secretary, a weathered man named Alric, entered, the king gave only one instruction. The decree was not to be released yet. It would be sealed, copied twice, and carried through the palace's restricted channel, the one reserved for matters too sensitive for ordinary post. Alric took the folder in both hands. Before he left the room, he paused at the door and said quietly, almost to himself, that some decisions take longer to survive than they do to sign. 2,000 miles away, in a converted farmhouse outside a coastal town, Duchess Wren received the news through a short, formal phone call from the palace's legal office. She did not cry. She went very still, the way people do when grief hasn't caught up to shock yet. Her husband, Prince Cassian, watched her face change color and knew before she said a word that whatever had happened was final.
"They've signed it," she said.
Rowan and Aloan. They're out of the succession. Cassian felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. He had expected pressure. He had expected cold statements from the council, maybe even veiled threats about press coverage. He had not expected his own father to put a pen to paper and make it real. For years, Cassian had lived at the edges of Valemore's royal machinery, having stepped back from formal duties not long after his marriage. He understood, better than most people outside the palace gates, what the line of succession actually meant, not a ceremonial list, but the working order of who could legally inherit the throne, right down to the exact positions of every cousin and grandchild. Losing a place in that list wasn't symbolic. It was a door closing on a possibility his children hadn't asked for and would never have chosen, and it was closing before they were even old enough to understand what had been taken from them. Wren looked at her husband with something sharper than sadness. "Did you know this was coming?" He didn't have an answer strong enough to give her peace. She walked to the window and stood there for a long moment, watching Rowan and Aloan playing in the garden below, entirely unaware that a phone call 2 minutes earlier had quietly rewritten the shape of their future. Wren had married into a family that photographed beautifully and forgave slowly, and she had known, on some level, that this reckoning might come one day. Knowing it and living it, she was discovering were not the same thing at all. "They're children," she said, not really to Cassian, more to the glass. Whatever this is about, it isn't about them. Cassian didn't argue. He knew she was right, and he knew, too, that being right had never once been enough to stop a decision like this from being made. In the capital, Edric's elder son and heir apparent, Prince Tamsin, had spent the previous week in closed meetings with the council, though he had never touched the pen himself. Tamsin was the one who would inherit whatever uncertainty his father left behind, along with his own 3 children, who were being raised inside the full weight of court life. He understood, in a way his brother Cassian perhaps could not, that an unclear line of succession doesn't stay quiet. It waits, and it resurfaces exactly when a kingdom can least afford it. It was Tamsin's private warning, delivered to their father weeks earlier, that had ultimately tipped the decision. He had told Edric that leaving Rowan and Alohan's status unresolved risked turning a family matter into a constitutional one, that ambiguity today could become leverage tomorrow, used by anyone from a scheming minister to a foreign court eager to destabilize Valemor's throne. He had not asked for the children's removal out of malice. He had asked for clarity, believing clarity was its own form of protection, even if it cost him his brother's trust. The rift between the 2 princes had been building for over a year, since a tense exchange at a public ceremony where Cassian had confronted Tamsin directly, asking for a written guarantee that his children's royal standing would never be quietly stripped away. Tamsin had refused to make that promise. He told his brother that royal placement could never be treated like a private guarantee, not when every informal promise risked becoming a formal liability for the crown down the line. Cassian had accused him of hiding behind duty. Tamsin had not backed down, though the cost of that conversation had stayed with him every day since. When Edric finally summoned Cassian to the palace, the meeting he walked into was not a negotiation. It was already over before he arrived. The decree sat signed on the desk between them. Cassian looked at his father and understood, with a kind of grief that had nowhere left to go, that he had been called in not to be consulted, but to be told. "You didn't just remove their names from a list," Cassian said quietly before he left the room. "You taught them where they stand in this family." Edric said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like an excuse. Within days, the story broke publicly, not through a leak, but through a brief, carefully worded palace statement confirming that changes had been made to formalize the future line of succession. It didn't name names directly. It didn't need to. Every major paper in Valemor ran some version of the same image the next morning, a stylized family tree, 2 branches shaded pale, beneath a headline that simply read, "The line redrawn." Outside the palace gates, a crowd gathered that had no real precedent to compare it to. Some defended the king's decision as necessary foresight. Others called it cruelty, dressed up as governance. One elderly woman, interviewed briefly by a local broadcaster, said the thing that ended up being repeated for days afterward, that watching a family choose duty over blood felt like watching history harden into something colder than it used to be. Inside the farmhouse by the coast, Wren turned off the television before the segment ended. She did not want Rowan and Alohan, still years from understanding any of it, to grow up hearing their names spoken like a headline. Cassian sat beside her in silence, carrying a guilt that had no clean shape, not quite regret, not quite anger, just the weight of watching consequences land on people who had never made a single choice in the matter. In the long study, King Edric sat with the morning papers spread in front of him, the image of the redrawn family tree staring back at him in newsprint. He had protected the throne's future the way his advisors insisted he must. He had also, in the same motion, closed a door on 2 grandchildren he loved without qualification. Both things were true, and neither one canceled the other out. Tamsin visited his father that evening, and the 2 men sat for a long while without speaking. It was Tamsin who finally broke the silence, saying that he did not think the decision would ever stop hurting the family, even if history eventually judged it necessary. Edric nodded slowly. He had come to the same conclusion days earlier, alone, long before anyone else in the palace had said it aloud. There was no clean victory in what had happened. Edric had preserved the stability of the crown, but at the cost of a piece of his own family he would never get back. Tamsin had protected the throne's future, but inherited a brother's resentment as the price. Cassian had lost an appeal he never truly had the standing to win. And Rowan and Aloan, far too young to understand any of it, had lost a possible future before they were old enough to know it had ever belonged to them. In Valemore, as in most old crowns, love could soften a family's private moments, but it was duty, in the end, that wrote the official record.